Few people who are interested in the history of Soviet armored vehicles have not heard the legends about the mysterious tank T-51. They say it was developed at tank plant number 183 in Kharkiv as early as 1938. But there are so many rumors, half-truths, and outright fabrications about this tank that I decided to tell the true story of its creation based exclusively on facts. After the political events of 2014, the new Ukrainian government took a course that destroyed its own economy and launched a civil war in the east of the country. The Kharkiv armored tank plant began repairing equipment for government forces. In such a situation, the plant archives were of no interest to anyone. People who knew the true history of the plant from their fathers and grandfathers did not want to serve the new authorities and left their jobs. The new management was not interested in any of that. They were interested only in restoring military equipment. But if they were not interested, then we are very interested, and those archival documents, and especially the respectable people, the plant veterans who can still tell a lot. And this story began back in 1936. The management of the Kharkiv plant tried to bring the super heavy tank, T-35A, which was produced in small batches, into an acceptable condition. Without substantial modernization, this was impossible. Eventually, they managed to agree with the military department on measures to reduce the tank's weight. The fact was that the T-35A weighed 56 tons, although its engine and running gear had originally been designed for a vehicle weighing only 42 tons. They planned to reduce the weight to 52 tons. To do this, they needed to reduce the thickness of the horizontal armor, lighten a perfectly reliable suspension, install new light road wheels and narrower tracks, make fuel tanks from fiber, and so on. In general, they planned to save about 4.4 tons of weight. Unfortunately, the program to cure the excess weight of the T-35A was never implemented, although the plant did very good work on the engine and running gear. And the new head of the military department responsible for tanks, an accountant by education, Hryhory Bokis, issued an alternative modernization program to the Kharkiv plant. He presented it in the form of a government decree dated July 25, 1937, which demanded a substantial increase in the thickness of the hull and turret armor. Since this was completely impossible and the plant understood that perfectly well, the matter of increasing the armor was simply ignored, and they continued to work on improving the engine and running gear of the serial tank. But Bokis did not calm down. In his letter to the plant director dated September 13, 1937, he wrote, "The results of recent battles show that tanks with armor thinner than 1.2 inches do not provide protection against an armor-piercing projectile of 1.5 inches in caliber at distances up to half a mile and closer. We propose that you consider the possibility of strengthening the armor of the heavy tank T-35 to 2.4 inches at the front and to 1.2 inches on the sides, rear, and gun turrets." This acting head of the military department simply did not understand that doing this on a serial vehicle was impossible in principle. The plant calculated how much the weight would increase with the thicknesses proposed by Bokis, and with a clear conscience, continued work on improving the T-35A without the fatal practical increase in armor thickness. Only in theory did they consider various options for strengthening the armor protection. Doing this in practice was pointless, since the tank was already overloaded. When Bokis learned of this, he was extremely outraged. But in response to his complaint, the director of the Kharkiv plant replied on October 7, 1937, with a formal letter. He said that since the plant had still not received any specific technical requirements from the customer, the design bureau was modernizing the tank at its own discretion. When Bokis realized how cleverly he had been outmaneuvered on his favorite bureaucratic field, he began to fuss. But clear technical requirements from the tank directorate arrived at the Kharkiv Locomotive Works only in November. And they stunned everyone. Now half dead from excessive weight, the T-35A tank had to be burdened even more. Its frontal armor was to be increased to 3 inches, and all other vertical armor, including the turrets, to between 1.6 and 1.8 inches. At the same time, the total weight of the tank was allowed to rise only to 66 tons. How it would crawl after such an ordeal. It seems no one really thought about it, but they should have. Even the preliminary calculations showed that the T-35A tank, with the armor specified in the requirements, would definitely exceed 66 tons. The design bureau of the plant simply capitulated before such an unsolvable task. and out of despair, they quietly began to work on unapproved changes to the tank's structure. They drew up as many as 7 different versions of the monster, each one more curious than the last. Just in case, perhaps they would need those papers to cover their own backs. After all, paper can endure anything. But there was no need to cover anything. Bokus was arrested and executed just in time. However, no one intended to leave the Kharkiv plant in peace. In early spring of 1938, the new head of the Tank Directorate, Dmitry Pavlov, who had taken the position in December 1937 and was well aware of all the T-35A's problems, assigned the plant to develop a fundamentally new heavy breakthrough tank, again weighing no more than 66 tons. This was the objective limit, not only for the technology of that time, but even for the future capabilities of Soviet logistics. The design featured 3 turrets. Armor thickness ranged from 3 to 1.8 inches. The transmission and suspension were to follow the layout of the T-35A. The armament was impressive: 1 76mm gun, 2 45mm guns, 2 heavy 12.7mm machine guns, and 4 to 6 machine guns of regular caliber. This was when the plant's semi-secret developments, those alternative designs for a reworked T-35A, came in handy. But the Kharkiv plant's monopoly on the new monster's design did not last long. By April and May, experimental plant number 185 joined the work. Naturally, since this was not a modernization of an existing tank, but the creation of a completely new one, the experimental plant, along with its own design bureau, had been established precisely for such tasks. And on Khotin's initiative, the Leningrad Kirov plant also joined in. It had long been attempting to modernize the medium 3-turret T-28 tank, and had accumulated significant experience working with heavy designs. Thus, by May 1938, the program had turned into a real competition. But the customer was in no hurry to shower the participants with gold. The endeavor was too expensive. So for several months, they only carried out preliminary sketch design. And by August 1938, when the financial rain finally began to pour, the Kharkiv plant was no longer among the competitors. And for good reason. By then, the Kharkiv plant had entered the decisive phase of its programs to modernize the BT-7 tank and the new wheeled-tracked A-20 tank. The technical assignment for the A-20, then still listed as BT-20 and formally considered a continuation of the BT line, had been received by the plant back in October 1937. But progress was slow, which greatly irritated Moscow and led to severe punitive measures against the plant's management. That is why the plant tried to concentrate all its efforts on these projects. Moreover, in the autumn of that same year, 1938, with the design team freed from the heavy breakthrough tank topic, the plant, on the recommendation of the People's Commissar of Defense, Voroshilov, simultaneously began work on a purely tracked and better protected version of the A-20, the A-32 tank. The culmination of that work would be the legendary T-34. So there is no misfortune without good fortune. One's tragedy becomes another's relief. What had the Kharkiv Locomotive Works managed to do in less than 4 months of leisurely preliminary design of a new heavy breakthrough tank? A small group of design engineers worked on the project while at the same time amusing themselves with 7 fantastic projects of what cannot be. At the same time, nobody canceled work on the serial T-35A tank. On the contrary, the factory pushed hard at developing conical turrets for it and installing armor of a thickness as great as possible. The result was the T-35A of the 1939 pattern, with conical turrets, armor 2 3/4 inches thick on the vertical frontal parts of the hull, and 1-inch armor on the sides and the under-turret housing. The weight of this final version of the T-35A rose to 119,000 pounds, but the thoroughly upgraded transmission somehow held up. And so we have come to the legendary A-51. By the way, it is worth correcting immediately. Not T-51, such an index did not exist in reality, but A-51 because the tank never left the design stage naturally was never accepted for service, and in the documentation was recorded under the index A, as were all experimental developments of the 183rd tank plant. The numeric cipher 51 is also not legitimate and does not reflect the numbering of the plant's experimental developments or the tasks of the Automobile Armor Tank Directorate. It is merely a strictly imposed mass limit set for the designers, which they were not allowed to exceed, because the tank was supposed to be based on the power plant and assembly components of the serial T-35A. In this respect, the factory management's strict requirements differed greatly from the wishes of the Automobile Armor Tank Directorate, which, speaking of suspension and transmission of the T-35A type, had in mind not the old equipment at all, but everything new, originally calculated for a tank mass of 132,000 pounds. But the plant had just successfully modernized and perfected the T-35A's power plant and assembly components. There were no serious complaints about the suspension at all. So why waste time and distract people? It was simpler to compress the requirements a little. Tricky fellows. As usual, the problem was first attempted to be solved with minimal bloodshed. Fortunately, the Automobile Armor Tank Directorate, in the person of Pavlov, in no way hindered the Kharkiv plant's desire to make a new tank using as much as possible of the serial T-35A's developments, if, of course, it would meet all the specified tactical and technical characteristics, which, however, the Kharkiv plant interpreted somewhat in its own way. But an attempt is not torture, and in the first sketches, the Kharkiv Design Bureau tried to satisfy all the customers' wishes. Therefore, there is nothing simpler than to imagine the same T-35A, but instead of 5 turrets, only 3, the main one in the center and 2 small gun turrets forward. Let us look at the preliminary sketch. It is also not hard to understand that with such an arrangement and the specified level of armor protection, 3 inches of frontal armor and 1 3/4 inches of armor plus 0.6 of an inch screens on the sides, it would be difficult not only to fit within 112,000 pounds, but even within 132,000 pounds. Moreover, with such turret placement, it was impossible to give up the large and heavily armored under-turret housing, which weighed more than the main turret. And accordingly, if it was impossible to fit within the specified mass, then it was impossible to use the T-35A's assembly components. A dead end. Miracles do not happen. It was no accident that the heads of the Kharkiv Locomotive Building Plant, in the persons of Koshkin and Morozov, had a reputation for being extraordinarily cunning, understanding that the most important thing in their work, the thing that one could lose a career or even a life over, was not a new, heavy breakthrough tank at all, but the A-20 and A-32 projects, and seeing no way to satisfy the requirements of the Tank Directorate without simply beginning to design a new vehicle from scratch, while having absolutely no experience in developing such tanks from scratch, they resorted to all sorts of tricks, not shying away from the simple falsification of the parameters of the new tank, including its architecture, its armament, and its armor protection. The main thing was to slap together in a hurry a project that more or less resembled the one specified in the technical assignment, without straying too far beyond the same critical 110,000 pounds, which would have been simply catastrophic, and the fact that the tank would slightly fail to meet the technical requirements, well, they would be scolded, but they certainly would not be removed from their posts. The task was completed, and how it was completed, that was already a purely debatable question. The Design Bureau of the experimental plant of Spetsmaschtrest, under the leadership of Ginsburg, had been fooling the Soviet army in the same way throughout the entire 1930s. And the same comrade Koshkin had worked for Ginsburg as his deputy and knew the whole kitchen of these manipulations from top to bottom. The most interesting thing is that this practice later firmly entered the everyday life of the Design Bureau of the Kharkiv tank plant. Competing in the development of new tanks with their Ural colleagues, the Kharkiv designers each time promised the Soviet army leadership an incredible superweapon. In the end, the machine that emerged was either worse than the Ural one or an excessive exoticism, as a rule very, very raw. Moreover, it was difficult and took a long time to bring it into working order, if it was brought into working order at all. The Ginsburg-Koshkin-Morozov school in action. But let us return to our dog, the A-51 tank. Designing it already in a sly way, the designers decided to take emergency measures. They paired a 45mm gun with a 3-inch gun in a single gun turret. Instead of a second 45mm gun, they armed the tank not with 2, as ordered, but with as many as 3 heavy-caliber machine guns, 2 of which were to be installed in small turrets, and the third, if possible, in the rear niche of the main turret in a separate ball mount. The DT machine guns in the tank, as ordered, were to number from 4 to 6. one in each small turret paired with heavy caliber DKs, one DT in a separate ball mount of the main turret so as not to depend on the heavy gun cluster, and one more DT in the frontal part of the hull with the radio operator gunner. The fifth DT was a spare and was installed on an anti-aircraft turret on the roof of the main turret. Now the most interesting part. In order to do away with both the bulky turret basket and the need for heavy armor on the small turrets, those same turrets were made single-seat with purely machine gun armament. This was entirely permissible, and installed behind the main turret, which in fact was supposed to shield them from artillery fire from the front. At the same time, the turrets could quite successfully perform their main function, providing the tank with close combat self-defense with flanking fire, which was especially relevant for a tank whose frontal armor alone was fully proof against shells, and which it was desirable to protect from side fire, if not with heavy armor, then at least with a dense curtain of fire. The combination of a heavy caliber and a regular machine gun was as suitable as could be. From their fire, primarily from the heavy caliber of course, no shields or earthworks saved. In July 1938, the final version of the sketch project was approved and signed by the plant's chief designer Mikhail Koshkin and its new director Alexander Morozov. The longtime plant head Ivan Bondarenko was arrested in May 1938. The project was sent to Moscow and, compared with similar sketches from the experimental plant and the Leningrad Kirov plant, it lost badly, which is not surprising. The project was raw. In blunt street language, it was done just to have something. The justification was ironclad. Investigative measures at the plant, which began after the arrest of Bondarenko, seriously slowed the work. In fact, the tank was being developed at the Kharkiv Steam Locomotive Plant on a residual basis, with only selective consideration of the specified technical characteristics, outright manipulation of them, and with the maximum preservation of the technological layout from the T-35A tank. And why be surprised? Having just taken the position of head of the design bureau, Koshkin first of all failed the order for the new tank of the BT-20 series. In his own words, he was solving only one problem there: how to make a 3-axle wheeled drive while leaving everything else from the old design unchanged. But the Army expected from him a tank with significantly improved characteristics overall. The project had to be reworked already under the new name A-20 according to a much more detailed technical assignment from the main tank directorate. And there you could not step back even a single step. The requirements were very strict. And here you involuntarily recall the words of the unforgettable Victor Chernomyrdin. This never happened before, and suddenly again. First with the BT-20, now with the A-51. In Moscow they did not appreciate this suddenly again. But they did not get angry. They were bought off by very good sketches presented by competitors of the Kharkiv Steam Locomotive Plant. Besides, the leadership understood that for plant number 183, the topic of the A-20 and A-32 tanks was undoubtedly more important now. Therefore, they readily gave the Kharkiv people permission to withdraw from further participation in the competition for the new heavy breakthrough tank. The A-51 project was simply thrown into the trash and no one mentioned it again. Precisely because of all these circumstances, in August, when generous funding for work on new heavy tanks began, the Kharkiv plant was no longer among the lucky ones. And it is unlikely that it was very upset about that. Although the tank never left the preliminary design stage and its final drawings were not preserved, one can easily imagine how it looked based on the capabilities of the Kharkiv plant at that time. And the capabilities were as follows. The hull was taken from the T-35A tank, minus, of course, the extra length and the bulky, heavy box under the turret. And given Koshkin's love of sloped armor, the rational slope of the frontal plates of the hull was also applied. That is, instead of the specified 3 inches of vertical armor, it was designed with only 2.4 inches of armor at rational angles of inclination. It was assumed that this would even be stronger. The engine and transmission were also taken from the same T-35A. The M17 engine at that time had just been successfully uprated to 580 horsepower, modification M17F. And to make life easier for the transmission, it was used in its most proven version. In real history, the serial T-35A, weighing up to 62.8 tons with that transmission, sustained a range greater than the legendary T-34, up to 1,240 miles, albeit with one scheduled replacement of worn parts. and the T-35A of the 39th year, weighing 65.0 tons, ran on it quite confidently. And the tank itself, thanks to the new layout, with a short hull without the box under the turret and with 3 turrets instead of 5, was planned to be made with a mass of no more than 65.0 tons, not 56 tons as in the specification, of course. But when did the specified and achieved mass ever match for Soviet designers? The suspension was again taken from the T-35A. Why reinvent the wheel? But, and this is important, in the final version of the tank, all suspension elements, again for the sake of weight reduction, were lightened in accordance with the T-35A weight reduction program of 1936 to 37. Moreover, they were slightly smaller in dimensions. This especially applied to the road wheels and their balancers, as well as to the drive and idler wheels, which were lightened thanks to the use of higher quality materials. 1 fewer return roller was installed, and overall the travel became significantly shorter and lighter, as did the armored false side skirt that covered them. Armor, formally, as ordered. The frontal part of the hull guaranteed protection no worse than 3 inches of vertical armor, 2.4 inches with sloped installation. The side, 1.4 inches of main armor plus 0.4 inches of screen, in total the same 1.8 inches prescribed in the technical specification. Although there they required at least 1.8 inches of main armor alone. Well, the designers did not sort it out, they did not understand. They made a small mistake. It happens. One can understand and forgive, especially since, just in case, side screens of 0.6 inches were designed instead of 0.4 inches, which together with 1.4 inches of main armor would give as much as 2 inches of armor. True, it is unknown how the suspension and mechanisms would react to such an increase in weight, but that is their problem. Conical turrets were being developed precisely for another modernization of the T-35A tank. Naturally, these same technologies were never more suitable than for a new heavy tank. Moreover, the small turrets did not even need additional armor, only their dimensions had to be slightly increased so that the coaxial mounting for a DSHK and a DT machine gun would fit properly. There is no detailed information about the main turret, except for the mention that its dimensions were to allow the free installation of the coaxial mounting of any 76.2 mm caliber gun and a 45 mm gun. By the way, a similar turret was developed somewhat later for the KV tank prototype at the Leningrad Kirov plant. Only the armor of the KV turret was much thicker, and the DSHK machine gun in the rear niche was abandoned because of cramped conditions, as in fact was the 45 mm gun in the coaxial mounting. The Kharkiv Locomotive Plant in mid-1938, of course, did not yet have the technology to manufacture thick armored conical turrets, at most 25 to 30 millimeters. Therefore, the main turret would have to be screened with those same 25 millimeter armor plates. In total, that is 50 to 55 millimeters, moreover not monolithic, but formally still more than 45 millimeters. However, most likely this option was considered temporary. After all, by the late 1930s for Soviet industry, the manufacture of thick armored turrets for heavy tanks was no longer an unsolvable problem, especially since for the experimental heavy tank T-100, which was being developed by the 185th Experimental Plant, the hull and turret with armor thickness of 50 to 60 millimeters were manufactured at that same Kharkiv plant. As a result, by the end of July 1938, when the subject of a new breakthrough heavy tank at the Kharkiv plant was closed, the A-51 in its final form and full configuration would most likely have looked exactly like this. And now let us fantasize a little and imagine that the 183rd plant not only did not obtain Moscow's permission to close the A-51 program, but on the contrary received personnel to strengthen the development group, at least in the form of graduates from the Military Academy of Mechanization and Motorization of the Red Army, who, by the way, as a diploma project under the guidance of Ermolaev, developed a single-turret heavy armor tank. This very work served as the starting point for the development of the future KV heavy tank, and a carte blanche in terms of funds and resources, as somewhat later, in August 1938, the 185th plant and the Leningrad Kirov plant received. Moreover, the head of the Automobile and Armored Department, Pavlov, took the development of the new tank at the Kharkiv plant under his constant personal control. the possibility of obtaining a new heavy tank on a modified T-35A chassis undoubtedly interested him greatly, and easily accommodated the plant workers in their strategic task of fitting into those same 50 tons. Provided that the tank would come out impervious to the standard anti-tank defense, means of likely opponents from the sides and to divisional artillery from the front. Given that the tank of the 183rd Factory was based on well-mastered components, assemblies, and technologies, there is no doubt that the A-51 would have been built much earlier than the SMK from the Leningrad Kirov plant, not to mention the later KV and T-100 from the 185th Factory, especially since the hull and turret of the T-100 were in fact manufactured at the Kharkiv plant. And why would the very clever Comrade Morozov hurry to produce a rival tank? And here is the most interesting part. When, in December 1938, a decision was made to reduce the number of turrets to 2 and to lower the mass from 60 to 55 tons, this was simply irrelevant for the A-51. The A-51's mass was not supposed to exceed 54 tons due to limitations of its assemblies, and although it still had 3 turrets, 2 of them were small auxiliary turrets with 25mm armor and purely machine gun armament. And because they were mounted abeam, there was no point in canceling one of them. In other words, with a certain favor from the customer, the A-51 could, as before and without major design changes, compete both with the 2-turret SMK and even, for some time, with the single-turret KV. The production of the T-100 at the Kharkiv plant would almost certainly have been quietly sabotaged, and the 185th Factory did not have an industrial base capable of building such heavy, thickly armored tanks. The fact that the A-51's armor protection was somewhat weak on the sides and rear by comparison with the technical requirements and with its competitors was not critical. According to the developer, at ranges from which the same 37 to 47mm anti-tank gun could penetrate it, if it could at all, the machine guns of the small turrets would have put both the guns themselves and their crews out of action, unless of course they were hidden in concrete pillboxes. Moreover, the armor thickness could have been increased. The official technical requirements of December 1938 specified a maximum mass of up to 60.6 tons, about 133,600 pounds. The A-51 weighed less, and if the T-35A of the 1939 pattern somehow moved under a mass of 59.5 tons, then the A-51, probably with no less success, would also have moved even if it exceeded a mass of 60.6 tons, but not by much. Another question is that transmission problems would again have arisen. But if the A-51 were now being worked on seriously, deeply, and with quality, moreover under constant supervision, and with the full support of Pavlov, who did not hesitate to commission a new planetary transmission for the T-34 from 3 different organizations, who said that a new transmission for the A-51 could not have been fabricated, there would be no need to distract factory designers for this. For the T-28, a new transmission was quite successfully developed at the Military Academy of Mechanization and Motorization. There was another option for strengthening the armor, following the example of the heavy KV tank from the Leningrad Kirov factory, switch to a single turret layout, shorten the hull, and increase the armor. But that work is rather labor-intensive, in effect creating a new tank, and requires the involvement of large design teams and time is an extremely important factor. Developing a new heavy tank based on the work done on the T-35A in the first variant would not have taken long, and Pavlov was constantly pushing. In trials, the Soviet military, of course, would also not have seen anything outstanding, except that because of the cramped main turret, it would have been necessary to abandon the 45mm gun, the ball-mounted machine gun, in the rear niche in the absence of such a niche, and the separate DT machine gun mounting in the front part of the turret, transferring it to the place of the 45mm gun in a coaxial mount with the 3-inch gun, as was the case on the KV. Although the more preferable option seems to be mounting in coaxial pairing with the 3-inch gun, the large caliber DSHK machine gun. By the way, about the 3-inch gun, why would it suddenly become cramped during trials? It is simple. Instead of the highly dubious L-10 gun, the A-51 turret was supposed to be fitted with the L-7, a tank gun made on the basis of the Lender anti-aircraft gun, a very powerful 40 caliber piece with a more or less working semi-automatic mechanism. In real history, the gun was not accepted for arming the T-35A and T-28 for one reason only. Its breech block was so bulky that the unified turret of these tanks would have been transformed from 3-man to 2-man, which the military considered unacceptable. In the new A-51 turret, Soviet designers could already afford to install the L-7 and even in a coaxial pairing with the DSHK without the risk of losing the loader. In general, the only problem of the layout of the new A-51 turret was the absence of a rear niche because of the small turret cheeks behind it. And because of them, the impossibility of full rotation of the turret, that is a serious drawback. And to have in the tank a long arm capable of knocking out the enemy's anti-tank weapons without entering the zone threatened by those same anti-tank weapons. Pavlov's cherished dream since Spain. Another question is that production of the L-7 at that time was already an incredible matter, and tanks would most likely have been armed with the Mahanov L-10. To launch into small series production instead of the T-35A, withdrawn from production by a special decree of the USSR government dated June 8, 1939. Now the T-51 with Pavlov's full support could have been done during the second half of 1939, when tanks were being assembled almost one by one, and no measures for a complete reorganization of the conveyors were required for mass production of a fundamentally new heavy tank. The Leningrad Kirov factory would in any case already be getting prepared. Why was this necessary if significantly better heavy tanks SMK and KV from the Leningrad Kirov factory were on the way? The thing is that the T-35A tanks had long been obsolete, and the dates for the start of serial production of the new machines were still very much in question. They had not even passed trials, let alone been accepted into service. That is, the T-51 tank was an excellent transitional machine between the obsolete T-35A and a new generation tank, SMK or KV. After all, the T-100 turned out to be heavier than specified in the technical assignment, had the thinnest armor among the competitors, was too exotic in design, which was traditional for Plant 185, and in trials performed worse than the competitors. And in the end, on the Karelian front of the Winter War, at the turn of 1939 and 1940, not 3 experimental tanks would have arrived as in real history, the SMK, T-100, and KV. But in addition to them, or even earlier, at least a dozen T-51 tanks from the first production batch, formed into a special breakthrough company leading 100 T-28 tanks of the 20th Mechanized Corps, together with a rifle division reinforced by a brigade of light T-26 tanks. They would have pierced straight through the Finnish defense. After all, the Finns' 20mm anti-tank guns and their few 37mm guns could not penetrate the armor of the T-51, while their 47mm anti-tank guns existed only in minuscule numbers at that time. Under such conditions, the Soviet forces would have had the opportunity to expand a tactical breakthrough into an operational one and decide the outcome of the entire campaign 2 or 3 fundamentally important months earlier than it happened in real history, saving many human lives.